That evening, as Ethan Walker stood at the floor-to-ceiling windows of his penthouse, with a glass of Burgundy in hand and $300 million of steel cutting through the Pacific somewhere below him, he asked a question he had never asked before. It was casual. It was offhand. It was the kind of thing a man says when he is already thinking about something else entirely. He turned slightly toward the kitchen, toward the quiet, efficient presence who had kept his world in order for 3 unbroken years, and said, without looking up from his phone, "Emily, don't forget dinner tonight. We have guests." There was a pause, not a long one, but long enough that he finally looked up. Emily Hartwell stood with a dish towel folded neatly over one arm. Her dark hair pulled back the way it always was. Her expression composed and gentle the way it always was, and she smiled at him the way she always did when she was about to say something he did not expect. "I'm sorry, Mr. Walker," she said. "I'm afraid I'll be home late tonight. I have a date." The wine glass did not fall. The phone did not drop. But something inside Ethan Walker cracked open just slightly. The way a window cracks when the pressure outside shifts without warning. And for the first time in longer than he cared to admit, he had absolutely no idea what to say. He was 38 years old, and by every measure that the world used to take stock of a man, Ethan Walker was exceptional. He had built the Walker Culinary Group from a single restaurant in downtown Seattle into a constellation of 8 Michelin-starred establishments spread across 4 continents, with the crown jewel, a floating dining experience aboard the super yacht, Meridian, regularly cited in the kind of glossy publications that only people who already had everything bothered to read. He was the sort of man whose name appeared in the same sentence as words like visionary and reclusive. A pairing that journalists loved because it made him sound both important and mysterious, though in truth the mystery was not deliberate. He simply had no interest in performing for people he did not respect. His penthouse in San Francisco occupied the top 2 floors of a building he also partially owned, which meant the view from his living room was of the bay and the bridge, and, on clear mornings, the faint outline of Alcatraz sitting in the fog, like a reminder that even the most fortified places eventually fall. He had earned that view. He had earned all of it. Through 18-hour days and countless sacrifices, and one marriage that had not survived the weight of his ambition. The divorce had been quiet, mutually agreed upon, and final. He did not speak of it. He did not need to. The people in his life who mattered understood, and the people who did not matter had never been given access to that part of him in the first place. After the divorce, Ethan had made a private decision, the kind that is never announced aloud, but simply becomes the architecture of a person's life. He would not date. He would not try again. The restaurant world had given him everything he had poured into it, and it was a demanding and jealous world that left very little room for softness. He told himself he preferred it that way. He told himself that the precise choreography of a perfectly executed service, the moment when every dish arrived at exactly the right temperature and every guest leaned back in their chair with the involuntary sigh of someone who had just tasted something they would remember, that was its own form of beauty. It was enough. The circle of people he trusted was tight and deliberately maintained. His executive chef, Marcus. His business partner, Daniel. A handful of old friends from before the money had changed everything. And Emily, though he would not have described Emily as someone he trusted so much as someone who had simply become, over 3 years of seamless invisible competence, a fact of his daily life, the way oxygen was a fact, noticed only when it was suddenly absent. Emily Hartwell had come to him through a staffing agency, the most exclusive kind, the sort that wealthy households used when they wanted discretion above all else. Her references had been impeccable. Her background check, clean, and her demeanor during the brief interview he had conducted on a Tuesday morning between a conference call and a flight to Tokyo had been exactly what he needed. Quiet. Precise. Unhurried. She was 29 at the time, and she had looked at his penthouse with an expression of polite appreciation rather than the wide-eyed hunger he sometimes saw in people who encountered his world for the first time. She had asked 3 practical questions about his schedule, confirmed her availability, and accepted the terms without negotiating. He had shaken her hand, thought that he had made an excellent hire, and promptly forgotten about her in the way that a man forgets about a perfectly functioning piece of equipment. She simply worked. She was there in the mornings before he woke, and gone most evenings before he returned. The apartment was always clean. The refrigerator always stocked to his precise specifications. The dry cleaning always collected and returned, with a silence so complete it was almost architectural. She had taken a single day off in 3 years, for reasons she did not share, and she had arranged for a substitute so seamlessly that he had not known she was absent until she mentioned it upon her return, almost as an afterthought. He had never asked her anything personal. She had never offered. That was, he had believed until the evening she told him she had a date, exactly the way things were supposed to work. The dinner guests that night were the kind of men who arrived by helicopter, and Ethan received them with the smooth, practiced ease of someone who had been hosting people of consequence for long enough that the performance had become second nature. But twice during the first course, he caught himself glancing toward the hallway. 3 times during the second, he checked his phone not for messages from his team but for the time. The conversation around the table was substantive, a proposed expansion into the Middle Eastern market, a new investment opportunity in a boutique vineyard in Burgundy, the usual calibrated dance of powerful men deciding which version of the future they preferred, and Ethan contributed to it with the precision that was expected of him. But some portion of his attention had slipped away and gone somewhere it had no business going. It had followed Emily out the door and into the city, and it was asking questions that Ethan could not silence, no matter how many times he told himself they were absurd. Who was he? Where were they going? Was it someone she had known a long time? Or someone new? Was she dressed differently? Was she laughing differently? That quiet, contained laugh she sometimes allowed herself when she thought he was not listening. He was furious at himself by the time the dessert arrived. And even more furious when he realized, with a clarity that was almost physical in its discomfort, that what he was feeling was not irritation at the inconvenience. It was something he had not felt in years, something he had been quite confident he had dismantled and stored away somewhere inaccessible. It was jealousy, specific, unglamorous, humiliating jealousy, directed at a man he had never met, over a woman he had told himself for 3 years that he had never thought about in any significant way. By the time his last guest departed, and the door closed behind him, and the penthouse settled into its familiar nighttime stillness, the silence felt different. It felt, for the first time he could remember, like an absence. He did not sleep. He sat in the leather chair by the window and watched the lights of the bay shift and scatter on the water below. And he turned the feeling over in his mind the way he turned problems over, examining it from every angle, looking for the flaw in the logic. He told himself it was territorial. He told himself it was simply that he had grown accustomed to Emily's presence in a way that was practical and unremarkable, and that any disruption to a reliable routine produced discomfort. He told himself many things, none of which satisfied him, and he was still sitting in that chair, the wine long finished and the room growing gray at the edges with pre-dawn light, when he heard the soft click of the front door. Emily came in quietly, the way she did everything. She stopped when she saw him. "Mr. Walker," she said. "I didn't realize you'd still be up. I was reviewing some figures," he said, which was a lie they both politely accepted. She nodded and moved toward the kitchen, setting her bag down with the same careful economy of motion she brought to everything, and he watched her from the chair and thought that she looked exactly the same as she always did, and also that she looked entirely different. And he could not explain why either of those things was true. In the days that followed, Ethan Walker became, for the first time in his life, observant in a way that had nothing to do with business. He had always prided himself on his attention to detail. It was, his mentors had told him early on, the quality that separated the merely successful from the genuinely great, but the detail he had paid attention to was always of the professional variety. The precise angle at which a sauce should be poured, the exact moment when a dining room shifts from pleasantly full to uncomfortably crowded. The particular quality of silence that told him a negotiation had reached its pivot point. He had never once applied that attention to Emily. Because Emily had been furniture, comfortable and reliable and invisible in the way that only truly excellent things are invisible. Now he could not stop. He noticed that she kept a small book on the kitchen counter. Tucked beneath a folded cloth so that only the spine was visible. One morning, while she was occupied elsewhere, he tilted his head to read it. An advanced text on international finance, the kind used in graduate business programs. He straightened quickly and said nothing. He noticed, in a subsequent week, that she had borrowed 3 volumes from his library on the subject of maritime law and returned them in less time than it would have taken him to read them, with small, neat pencil marks in the margins that he did not remember making. He noticed that when Marcus, his executive chef, came to the apartment to discuss a menu revision and used a phrase from classical French culinary tradition, Emily, passing through the room with a tray, corrected his pronunciation without pausing, in perfect French, with a naturalness that suggested the language was not something she had learned so much as something she had always inhabited. He started, carefully, and without acknowledging that he was doing it, to manufacture reasons to be in the same room as her. A question about the household schedule that could easily have been handled by text, a request for coffee that he did not particularly want, a comment on the weather that required no response. And in these manufactured proximities, he accumulated details with the obsessive precision of a man who has spent his life building something and has suddenly realized he has been building in the wrong direction. She knew wines. Not the way a person who has read about wines knows them, but the way someone who has grown up with them in the cellar and at the table knows them. She knew art, the actual history of it, not just the names. She moved through his penthouse with the ease of someone for whom high-ceilinged rooms and significant objects were entirely unremarkable. And yet there was nothing performative in her comfort, nothing that suggested she was trying to signal anything. She was simply at home in a way that, he was beginning to understand, had nothing to do with the apartment and everything to do with who she was. He told himself he was simply curious. He told himself this with diminishing conviction, in the way that a man tells himself a thing is fine when he has already begun to understand that it is not fine at all, and the telling has become less about belief and more about the maintenance of a particular self-image he had spent decades carefully constructing. The thing about Ethan Walker was that he had never in his adult life been uncertain about himself, uncertain about markets, about culinary trends, about the right moment to open or close a restaurant. Yes, those were business uncertainties, the kind that were managed with information and analysis and the disciplined suppression of emotion. But uncertain about himself, about what he wanted, about what he felt, that was a category of uncertainty he had eliminated from his life, along with so many other forms of inefficiency. He had decided who he was, and he had been that person with great consistency, and it had served him well. The uncertainty he now felt, sitting in board meetings and executive tastings and conversations with people who required his full attention, was therefore not merely unpleasant. It was structurally disorienting, the way it would be disorienting to find the walls of a building you had occupied for years suddenly at different angles than you remembered them being. The jealousy, meanwhile, had not receded. It had settled in, the way weather settles when it decides to stay. He did not see her leave for a second date, but on a Thursday evening when she mentioned casually that she would again be home after 9, he felt the same cold tightening in his chest that he had felt the first time, and he recognized it now, without the luxury of being able to pretend he did not know what it was. He sat through a dinner meeting with 2 of his investors that evening and conducted himself with complete professional composure. And the entire time, somewhere beneath the conversation and the wine and the careful back and forth of men deciding where their money should go, he was aware of a low and steady ache that he had not chosen and could not seem to dismiss. He had not felt this way in years. He had not allowed himself to feel this way in years. The discipline required to maintain his life, the restaurants, the yacht, the investments, the image demanded a certain emotional economy, a rigorous keeping of accounts in which sentiment was a liability. He had been good at that economy. He had been, he realized now, perhaps too good at it. The result was a life that was, by any external measure, a remarkable success, and which felt, on the particular evenings when a man has no particular project to absorb him, and the apartment is quiet, and the bay below moves in its ancient indifferent rhythms, somewhat like a very elegant room with the furniture all in the right places and nobody in it. The evening of the Meridian's annual gala was the 3rd Friday of October. It was the event by which the social calendar of a certain class of person was organized. A gathering of the genuinely wealthy aboard the most beautiful floating restaurant in the Pacific, with a waiting list that reached 18 months, and a guest roster that read like a financial summit dressed up in evening wear. Ethan had hosted it 4 times. He knew every detail of how it worked, every sequence of the service, every face that would appear. Or so he had believed. He was standing at the bow bar, speaking with a shipping magnate from Greece and a tech founder whose name appeared in headlines at least twice a week, when the change moved through the room, the way a change in temperature moves through a space not announced, simply felt. Conversations shifted almost imperceptibly. Heads turned. The kind of social reorientation that occurs when the most significant presence in a room has finally arrived. Ethan turned with the others because he could feel it too, and what he saw stopped every thought he had been having with a completeness that was almost violent. Emily stood at the entrance to the main salon in a gown the color of deep water at evening, floor length, understated in its elegance in the specific way that only the most expensive things manage to be understated. Her hair was down. He had never seen her hair down. Her posture was the same as it always was, straight, unhurried, particular, but in this context it read entirely differently. It read as the posture of someone who had grown up being looked at by rooms full of important people and had made peace with it a long time ago. Around her, the assembled guests of the Meridian Gala, men and women for whom the word impressive had long since lost most of its power, were doing something Ethan had rarely witnessed in this particular room. They were deferring. The Greek magnate to his left straightened slightly. The tech founder set down his drink. A man Ethan recognized as the chairman of one of the largest sovereign wealth funds in Southeast Asia crossed the salon toward her with genuine warmth on his face, both hands extended, and said, loud enough for the surrounding cluster of guests to hear, "It is a genuine honor that you came this evening. We had begun to think you'd given up on us entirely." Emily smiled, not her small, contained working smile, but the full thing, warm and unguarded and startling, and said something Ethan was too far away to hear. He was not aware that he had stopped breathing until his lungs reminded him. He spent the remainder of the evening watching her from a careful distance, and what he watched was a woman who moved through a room of the world's most powerful people, with the ease of someone who had been trained from childhood to exist in precisely these rooms. She spoke to a Japanese industrialist in what sounded like fluent Japanese. She listened to a Brazilian financier with the particular quality of attention that makes the person being listened to feel as though they are the only person present. She deflected a photographer with a gesture so subtle it was almost invisible, and the photographer thanked her for it. And through all of it, she did not look once in Ethan's direction. Not once, which was, he discovered, its own form of attention. He cornered her near the aft deck, where the city lights were sliding past in the dark water below, and the noise of the salon had softened to a distant warmth. "Emily," he said. She turned and looked at him with those composed dark eyes and waited. "I think," he said, and then stopped, because he had spent 38 years being precise with language, and he had no precise language for this. "I think I've made some assumptions," he finished, which was not adequate but was honest. She considered him for a long moment. The water moved below them. "So have I," she said finally, and then someone called her name from across the deck, and she excused herself with a grace he now understood was not learned but inherited, and he was left standing at the rail with the cold salt air and a feeling in his chest that he had no longer any interest in pretending was something other than what it was. Her name was not, it turned out, Emily Hartwell. It was Emily Hargrove. The Hargrove Group was not, as he learned in the week that followed through a combination of careful research and a conversation with Daniel that he initiated with uncharacteristic indirectness, a small company or a regional concern. It was one of the largest maritime logistics conglomerates in the Western world, a privately held empire that moved cargo across 6 oceans and employed more people than the entire workforce of several small countries. Her father, Robert Hargrove, was the kind of man whose photograph appeared in business publications below captions that used words like patriarch and visionary, a man whose opinion on the movement of goods across international waters was sought by governments. Emily was the eldest of his children, and the one who, by all accounts that Ethan could piece together from the public record, had simply one day declined the future that had been arranged for her and disappeared. She told him, herself. Eventually, it was a Sunday morning. The apartment quiet in the way that Sunday mornings in San Francisco are quiet, and she sat across from him at the kitchen table with her hands around a coffee cup and explained it with the same economy of language she brought to everything. She had not wanted the inheritance. More precisely, she had not wanted to inherit without understanding what she was inheriting, which meant understanding the people who made it work, which meant understanding labor from the inside, not the outside. She had spent 2 years before coming to him doing other kinds of work, other kinds of learning, accumulating a knowledge that she believed no boardroom education could have given her. She had come to him specifically because his operation was the kind she wanted to understand, the intersection of hospitality and logistics, and the particular demands of a high-stakes service environment. She had told her family she would be unreachable, in the sense that mattered, for an unspecified amount of time. They had not been pleased. There had also been the matter of a proposed engagement to a man named Carter Whitfield, the son of a business associate of her father's, which she had neither accepted nor formally declined, simply deferred while she was away. That deferral, she said, looking at the table rather than at him, had been one of the reasons for her extended absence. Ethan listened to all of this without speaking. When she finished, he said, "Were you ever going to tell me?" She looked up. "I wasn't sure it was relevant," she said, "until it was." He thought about that for a long time after she left the room. Carter Whitfield arrived on a Thursday, which was, Ethan reflected, an extremely Carter Whitfield kind of day to make an entrance. He was the sort of man who had been handsome in a catalog way since birth, and had organized his entire life around that fact, groomed and polished and confident in the specific manner of someone who had never been told no by anyone who held power over something he actually wanted. He appeared at the entrance to the Meridian during evening service with a bouquet that had clearly been ordered by an assistant and 2 aides, who clearly existed primarily to communicate that he was the kind of person who had aides, and he asked for Emily with the tone of a man asking for something he had already decided belonged to him. Ethan watched this from across the dining room with the particular stillness of a man who is deciding what kind of moment this is and what the correct response to it is. He had dealt with difficult men before. The restaurant world, and the business world more broadly, was populated with men who used proximity and confidence and the implied weight of their connections, the way other people used logic, as a substitute for actual reasoning. He was not afraid of Carter Whitfield. He was not even, precisely, angry at him. What he felt, standing at a careful distance and watching Emily receive this man with a composed politeness that contained not a single degree of warmth, was something much simpler and much clearer than anger. He was not afraid of Carter Whitfield. He was not even, precisely, angry at him. What he felt, standing at a careful distance and watching Emily receive this man with a composed politeness that contained not a single degree of warmth, was something much simpler and much clearer than anger. He felt entirely certain, for the first time, about something personal rather than professional, of exactly what he intended to do. The clarity of it was almost physical, the way the clarity of a well-made dish is physical, when the flavors are in exactly the right proportion and the technique is sound, and there is nothing to add and nothing to remove, and the thing simply is what it should be. He watched Carter Whitfield explain, in a voice calibrated for overhearing, that the Hargrove family was prepared to be patient, but that patience had a reasonable outer boundary, and that Emily's time away had been indulged long enough, and that there was a future waiting for her that had been carefully built, and that it would be a waste of considerable effort and considerable affection to decline it much further. Emily listened to this with the same composure she brought to everything, and when he finished, she said, simply and without heat, "No, Carter. I've already told you. The answer is no." Carter Whitfield's jaw tightened in a way that suggested he was a man who managed disappointment poorly. He looked at Ethan. Ethan looked back at him with the expression he reserved for health inspectors who believed their authority was the most important thing in the room. Whitfield left, but the visit had introduced into Ethan's life the awareness that Emily's situation was not without complication, and that the family pressure she had mentioned was not an abstraction. In the weeks that followed, there were calls. There were visits from representatives of the Hargrove Group who arrived in cars that cost more than some of Ethan's early restaurant build-outs, and spoke in the careful, measured language of people trained to apply pressure without ever creating legal liability. There were messages conveyed through intermediaries that the family's patience, while generous, was finite, and that Emily's future had been planned with more care than any individual's preferences could simply override. Ethan heard about some of these from Emily, who mentioned them with the same equanimity she might have used to mention a minor scheduling conflict. He heard about others through Daniel, who had contacts in the kind of financial circles where the Hargrove family was a significant gravity. What he heard was that the pressure was real and growing, and that the implied argument being made that Ethan Walker, for all his success, was not a sufficient reason for the Hargrove family to abandon a decades-long arrangement was the kind of argument that certain kinds of people found entirely reasonable. He did not find it reasonable. He found it, in fact, the clearest thing he had encountered in several years, a simple and uncomplicated fact about what he wanted and what he was prepared to do about it. He told Marcus first, because Marcus had known him since before any of this had been possible, and understood the difference between Ethan making a business decision and Ethan making a decision that mattered. Marcus listened without interrupting, which was itself unusual, and then said, "About time," which Ethan did not dignify with a response, but which he understood to be genuine. He told Daniel next, because the plan he was forming required resources and coordination and the kind of discretion that Daniel had spent a decade demonstrating. He did not tell Emily, because what he was planning was not something he intended to negotiate or discuss in advance. It was something he intended to do, and then she would know. The Meridian hosted a dinner on the first Saturday of November that had not been on any public calendar. Invitations had gone out 10 days prior through channels that ensured the right people were the only people who knew about it. And the right people in this case included the editors of 2 major financial publications, 4 of the most widely photographed figures in the world of international commerce, representatives of 3 families whose names were synonymous with old money on both coasts, and Emily's father. Robert Hargrove arrived aboard a tender from the dock at 7:15, preceded by his reputation and followed by 2 people who were clearly not assistants, despite holding the folders that assistants hold. He shook Ethan's hand with the grip of a man who uses handshakes to measure things, and Ethan shook back with the certainty of a man who has nothing to prove. The dinner was perfect, because Ethan's dinners were always perfect, and this one had been planned with a care that surpassed even his usual standard. The service was flawless. The courses arrived with the timing of something choreographed by someone who understood that food was not just food but theater, and that theater, at its best, produced a physical response in the people watching it. The wine pairings told a story. The room held its breath at the right moments, and when the final course had been cleared, and the dessert wine poured, and the guests settled into the easy warmth that comes after a great meal has done its work, Ethan stood at the head of the table. He spoke without notes. He had never needed notes. "I am not a sentimental man," he said, which several people in the room who knew him well recognized as both accurate and something close to an understatement. "I have spent my adult life in the belief that what I built was what mattered, and that the building was sufficient." He paused. He was looking at Emily, who was seated midway down the table in a dress the color of winter light, and who was looking back at him with an expression he had not yet learned to fully read, though he was beginning to. "I was wrong about that," he said. "I was wrong about several things, as it turns out, and I prefer, when I discover I've been wrong, to correct the error without delay." He looked then at Robert Hargrove, who had the expression of a man hearing something he has been waiting a long time to hear, but is still deciding whether to trust. "I am not asking for permission," Ethan said, because he was not a man who asked for permission, "but I am asking for your consideration. I love your daughter, not for what she comes from, or what she will inherit, or what her name makes possible. I love who she is when she's simply in a room. And I love that it took me far too long to understand that she was never simply anything." The room was quiet, in the way that good rooms go quiet when something real has been said. And Ethan sat back down. And across the table, Emily Hartwell Hargrove pressed her lips together and looked at her water glass and said nothing, which he had learned was the thing she did when she was most deeply moved. It was after the guests had departed, and the crew had begun the quiet work of clearing the salon, and the Meridian moved through the dark water toward the lights of the marina, that Robert Hargrove found Ethan alone on the forward deck. The older man stood beside him for a long moment without speaking, looking at the water the way men of a certain age look at things they have spent a lifetime trying to understand. "You know," Hargrove said, "I had you investigated. When Emily first took the position, I knew where she was the entire time." Ethan absorbed this. "I assumed as much," he said, which was not true but sounded better than the truth, which was that it had not occurred to him until just this moment. 3 years, Hargrove said. "She was in your home for 3 years, and you never once." He stopped. "No," Ethan said. "Never." Hargrove looked at him for a long time. He had the eyes of a man who had spent decades reading other people's reliability, looking for the place where the story and the person did not quite match. He did not appear to find that place in Ethan's face. "She chose well," Hargrove said finally, which was not an endorsement so much as a verdict. And Ethan received it as such. Robert Hargrove had done more than investigate Ethan at arm's length. This, Emily explained to him later that night, was the thing she had not quite found the right moment to say. Her father had not simply monitored from a distance and waited. He had been the one, 3 years ago, who had quietly arranged for Emily's name to reach the staffing agency that had placed her with Ethan. Not all of it had been Emily's independent decision. Her father had known about her plan to disappear into ordinary work, had not been able to stop her entirely, and had chosen instead to direct her disappearance toward a situation he could observe. He had chosen Ethan Walker specifically. He had read the file on Ethan Walker with the thoroughness he brought to all significant decisions and concluded, with the particular confidence of a man who has trusted his judgment for 6 decades and been right more often than not, that if his daughter was determined to spend time in someone's household, it might as well be the household of a man with genuine character. He had watched. He had waited. He had observed, through various channels, what 3 years of daily proximity and ordinary circumstance revealed about a person. And what it had revealed about Ethan Walker was that he was, beneath the wealth and the reputation and the careful control, a fundamentally decent man. He had never treated Emily as anything less than worthy of consideration. He had never leveraged his position over her. He had never been dismissive or condescending or careless, with the ordinary human dignity of someone in a position of dependence. These were not small things, in Robert Hargrove's accounting. They were, in fact, the largest things. "He told me himself, the night of the gala," Emily said. She and Ethan were sitting on the forward deck now, the city behind them and the open bay ahead. The stars doing what stars do over water when there is no moon to compete with them. He said he had his answer. He'd had it for quite some time. Ethan was quiet for a moment, looking at the water. "So, the date," he said. "The first time you told me you had a date." She was quiet for long enough that he looked at her. She was smiling, the small private one. "I went to meet him," she said. "He'd come to San Francisco. He wanted to. He wanted to give me the chance to choose, before things went any further. He knew by then, I think, that things were going to go further." Ethan thought about that night. The wine he had not tasted. The guests he had not properly attended to. The chair by the window and the long, sleepless hours before the sound of her key in the door. "You could have told me," he said. "Yes," she said simply, "but I wasn't ready. I needed a little more time." "Time for what?" "Time to love you as who I was," she said. "Before you knew who I was. Those are different things. Loving someone from the inside out, rather than from the name forward." He did not have an answer for that, because it was true in a way that he recognized as true. The way a person recognizes a thing they have always known but never had the language for. The engagement was announced 3 weeks later. The location was the Meridian, which struck everyone who heard it, while they were reviewing the event calendar one morning with the same calm practicality she had always brought to logistical questions, as though the decision of where to celebrate the beginning of their life together was not categorically different from the question of which produce supplier to approve. He had looked at her when she said it. She had looked at him back. It was, he thought, exactly the kind of thing she would do. And it was exactly the kind of thing He now understood that he had been watching her do for 3 years without realizing that he was watching a person he loved. The Meridian was lit from bow to stern. It was a clear evening, the kind that happens in San Francisco 3 or 4 times a year when every condition conspires in favor of beauty, the wind from the right direction, the temperature exactly at the point where warmth becomes welcome, the sky behind the bridge, that shade of amber that painters have been attempting since the first Europeans laid eyes on this particular stretch of Pacific coastline and realized they did not have the colors. The guests were the people from both their lives. Ethan's team, the people who had built the restaurants alongside him through the long years of grinding work and improbable success. Marcus with his quiet dignity and his genuine happiness for a man he had watched go hungry in a different way for years. Daniel, who made a toast that was genuinely funny and only slightly embarrassing. Robert Hargrove, who shook Ethan's hand again at the beginning of the evening, and this time the handshake was different. It was the handshake of a man who has made a decision and has no remaining reservations about it. And Emily's family. Her younger sister, who looked at Emily the way people look at someone they have been missing, and a handful of others who carried in their faces the particular relief of people watching someone they love arrive at the place that was always meant for her. The dinner Ethan designed for that evening was the best he had ever made. Not the most technically complex, or the most expensive, or the most discussed afterward by food journalists, who were not present, but who reconstructed it from the descriptions of those who were. Simply the best, in the way that something is best when it has been made with complete attention and without a single thought to anything other than the people it is for. Each course was a small story, a reference to a moment they had shared. The Burgundy from the first week she had worked for him, identified correctly when he had, for reasons he no longer remembered, offered her a glass one evening after a long day, and watched her close her eyes for a fraction of a second, before saying the vintage and the vineyard. Quietly, as though she hadn't quite meant to let him know. A dish with ingredients from the farmer's market she frequented on Saturday mornings, which he had discovered recently she had been visiting since her second week in San Francisco, because she believed that the quality of ingredients was the foundation of everything, and she had not been willing to compromise on it, even when shopping for someone else's kitchen. Small things, true things. The accumulated record of 3 years of ordinary days that had been, without either of them understanding it at the time, anything but ordinary. After the formal portion of the evening had concluded, and the guests had moved to the outer decks, and the music had shifted from the chamber ensemble to something warmer and easier, Emily found Ethan at the bow rail, which had become, without deliberate arrangement, the place where the two of them went when they wanted to be simultaneously in a crowd and apart from it. She stood beside him, and they both looked at the water for a while. Because they were both, at heart, people who were comfortable with silence, which was one of the many things about this that was exactly right. That first evening, she said, when you asked me to make dinner, he smiled without turning from the water. You said you had a date. I did, she said. I wasn't lying. I know, he said. You went to meet your father. Yes. She was quiet for a moment. I told him I needed more time, that I wasn't ready to end it yet. He looked at her then. The job? She met his eyes, and the look in them was the one he had been seeing since the evening of the gala, steady and warm and free of the particular reserve she had maintained for so long. I told him I had more to learn, she said, about the man I was falling in love with. I wanted to know you a little longer as just a man I worked for. Before everything else. He was quiet for a moment. Around them, the city moved in the darkness, and the water held its own light. You could have kept working for me, he said. She laughed, which was new, the full, easy sound of it. I don't think that would be entirely appropriate now. Probably not, he admitted. He reached for her hand. She gave it to him. It was the first time, which was also somehow impossible, and also exactly right. You don't have to take care of me anymore, he said. I want to, she said. That's not the same thing as having to. The Meridian moved through the harbor in the last light of the evening, her running lights casting small pools of gold on the dark water, and above the city the sky was doing the last thing it did before the dark came fully down, a deepening of the amber towards something richer and final. On the forward deck, 2 people stood at the rail and did not need to say anything, because some things are complete without words. and this was one of them. Behind them was a room full of people who loved them, and the particular warmth of a dinner made with care, and the sound of a life that had found its right shape. Ahead of them was the open water. Ahead of them was the Pacific in its full, enormous, patient darkness, which had been there before any of them, and would be there long after, and which did not require anything of the people who moved across its surface, except that they pay attention. They paid attention. 3 years of ordinary mornings, of coffee prepared with precision and groceries selected with care, of a presence that had been so reliable and so quiet that it had become indistinguishable from the air those 3 years resolved, in the backward light of understanding, into something else entirely. They resolved into the longest and most careful kind of love story, the kind that begins before either person has a name for it, that builds itself quietly in the spaces between words, in the slight pause before a door is opened, in the particular way a person moves through a room when they believe they are not being watched. Ethan Walker had spent 3 years looking at Emily without seeing her, and she had spent those same 3 years learning him with the complete and patient attention of someone who understood that the most important things take time. They had both been, in their different ways, building toward the same place. They had simply arrived from different directions, by different roads, and the road had been longer for both of them than either would have chosen. But they were here. The water was wide and dark and beautiful. The city burned its 1,000 ordinary lights behind them, and the ship moved forward, the way ships do, the way all things do when they have finally found the heading they were always meant to keep. What Ethan understood now, standing at the bow of his ship with the woman he had managed not to see for 3 years standing beside him, was that love of this kind, the kind that announces itself quietly, that accumulates in the background of a life without asking permission, that waits with a patience that has nothing to do with passivity, and everything to do with faith, was perhaps the most radical thing a person could allow themselves. He had built his entire life on the premise that what mattered was what he made, what he controlled, what he could point to as evidence of his capacity. And all of that was real, and all of it had cost him real things, and none of it had prepared him for the particular shock of discovering that the most important thing in his life had been present in it for 3 years, and he had not had the eyes to see it clearly. That was the humbling part. That was the part he would carry with him, not with shame, but with a new kind of attention, a resolution to look more carefully at the things and people that were closest to him, because proximity was not the same as knowledge, and familiarity was not the same as understanding. Emily had known this all along. She had come to him precisely to practice the discipline of understanding things from the inside, and she had understood him, in the end, before he had begun to understand himself. He thought that was probably something he should tell her, at some point. He also thought she probably already knew. She turned to look at him then, as though she had heard the thought, which was the kind of thing that would have seemed fanciful to him 3 months ago, and now seemed entirely plausible. She had that quality, the quality of a person who listens not just with their ears but with their full attention, and who therefore catches things that most people miss. He looked back at her. The light was the last of the evening light, the kind that makes every face look like the best version of itself, and her face in that light was the face he intended to look at for the rest of his life. He did not say that aloud, because it was the sort of thing that sounded better kept, for now, as a private knowledge, a fact he was still getting used to the weight of. He simply held her hand and looked at the water, and she rested her head very slightly against his shoulder, a gesture so small it might have been accidental and was absolutely not, and neither of them said anything, because the moment did not require it. The Meridian moved on through the harbor, her engines turning over with a low and steady certainty, and behind them the city did what cities do in the hour after the sun has gone, blazing up its 10,000 separate lights against the dark, as though to prove that human warmth persists even when the natural light has failed. Ahead of them was the Pacific, in its full, enormous, patient darkness, which had been there before any of them and would be there long after, and which did not require anything of the people who moved across its surface except that they pay attention. They paid attention.